Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. This is our fourth webinar of this academic year. My name is Matt Hilchey. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with the Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman team and the moderator for today's webinar. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BIOrg, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose three programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way of hearing firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral insights, particular behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. Today, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Jennifer Robson, an associate professor at Carleton University. Before I introduce Jennifer, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the chat tab at the top right of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all of the participants. At the end of this talk, time permitting, we will have a question and answer session, and I will select from those questions in the tab. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Robson. Jennifer is an associate professor in the graduate program in political management at Kroger College, Carleton University, where she teaches courses in public policy and research methods. Prior to joining Carleton, Dr. Robson worked in the Government of Canada and spent nearly a decade in the volunteer sector, holding senior roles in policy development and research. Dr. Robson is a member of the Asset Building Learning Exchange, a national cross-sectoral network engaged in the field of financial empowerment, and is a fellow at the Public Policy Forum. Without further ado, I'd like to extend a warm bear hug to Dr. Robson. Thank you very much for being here with us today. If you're all set, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt. And I hope that everyone can hear me okay. I'd also just like to say thank you very much to Dilip and his fantastic team for the kind invitation to be here and to all the work that I know goes into setting up these webinars. This is my first time giving a webinar, and so for those of you who are online, thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to thank you in advance for your patience, just in case I do something that screws up the interface in some way. Much of the talk that I'm going to be giving today comes from a paper that I co-authored with my terrific colleague, Joanna Keats here at Carleton, who's in the Department of Psychology. And it was published earlier this year by CPA Canada, but I'll also be talking about some work in progress. And on that in particular, I would very much welcome your questions and comments. We already know that one of the best ways to get people to save is by automation and, sort of automatic savings, automatic withdrawals from one account to another, and things like save more tomorrow pre-commitment mechanisms. But I've been wondering what these mechanisms look like to people who don't really know how much money they're going to have from one month to the next. People who study labor markets see signs that more workers are in gig employment than in the past, and that due to a wide range of economic factors, from automation to the ability now to break up jobs into component tasks, we should actually expect that this share of the labor force is going to increase. And here you see a recent study from the Bank of Canada showing that already nearly one in three workers in Canada report being involved in some kind of informal gig work. Most often, gig employment supplements part-time work or periods of unemployment. And here I think it's important to remind ourselves that when we're talking about these types of gig-like work, hours and earnings can be really uncertain. So looking forward, should we be expecting that more people will have volatile incomes and might feel some anxiety or discomfort with automated monthly savings products? Let me define what we mean by income volatility. Very simply, this is about relative swings that could be upwards or downwards in income. Now, there are ways to measure income volatility on a year-over-year basis, so changes in annual income, or more recently, there's been attention to swings within the year, so month-over-month uncertainty. Now, one way to measure volatility is, of course, to say how much of a relative swing matters. And most, I would say, not all, but most studies of income volatility have thought about volatility as being somewhere in the neighborhood of about a 25 or 30% change relative to the previous period. Uh, there we are. Okay. So previous studies in Canada have been fairly few and far between with regards to income volatility. Most of the work that has been done so far, at least by Statistics Canada and by terrific academics, has been able to look only at annual income volatility. So folks such as Morissette and Ostrovsky, Beach, Finney, and Gray have been able to use income tax return data to study changes in family income from one year to the next. And, they find overall instability in household incomes has risen since the late 1990s, depending on the age of major income earners, the composition of the family, somewhere between 15 and 39% of households are displaying some instability in their annual incomes. And you see some signs as well for age-related, gender-related, and family compositional differences there, as well as noting that lower income households tend to be at greater risk. That'll be an ongoing theme today. Garcia Mendez and Wen took this one step further and were also able to look at instability in the pre-tax and post-tax transfer income. So this is a way of understanding how does the overall tax and transfer system help people to smooth over or equivalize their income from one year to the next, right? Remember, some of these programs are meant to kick in. And what they find is that overall our system of public benefits in Canada, like employment insurance and like social assistance, are doing a little less today to reduce instability, but overall they do still have an effect. Because here's one way of thinking about it. If we have kind of employment related income on the one axis and time in years on the other, we know incomes can go up and down and dip. And we do have a series of programs in Canada, income tested programs like child benefits and the Canada Workers Benefit, that generally go up when employment income goes down. But these are really set up administratively and legally for adjusting to year over year changes based on income tax returns. They're not really set up to handle month to month fluctuations in income. And there are also other programs like employment insurance that I mentioned earlier, provincial social assistance, that are able to kick in as a residual system when market income is interrupted. And because these systems ask for month-to-month reports, they actually are the ones that do a much better job of adjusting benefits on a month-to-month basis. I think there are some important questions, though, about whether that they're doing that in a way that actually leaves households more financially secure and better able to take decisions. And I'll come back to that idea later in my talk. So to my knowledge, until Joanna and I put out our paper earlier this year, the only other report on monthly income volatility in Canada had come from a survey done for TD Bank by Ipsos. And what they estimate once they weight their sample for the Canadian population is that about 18% of Canadians experience at a 25% or greater change in monthly incomes at some point in the year. So this would be about 3.3 million Canadians. And that another important share of Canadians, so 5 million overall, have what they described as high volatility, where we're seeing not only the amount of income changing from one month to the next, but some uncertainty about where the income is going to be coming from. And again, they find that low income earners, younger workers, and self-employed persons are more likely to report this kind of volatility. Again, I think it's important to remember here, this is self-reported data. But interestingly enough, they didn't find an effect from education. They also asked in this study, they also asked people about their self-reported savings, their whether or not they engage in forward-looking financial planning, as well as their confidence about certain types of financial behaviors or activities. And what they did find was that income volatility was associated with lower saving, poorer planning, and overall lower confidence. More research on this monthly income volatility issue has been done in the United States. So a series of studies by researchers at JP Morgan Chase, these are the studies by Farrell and Grieg, have actually been able to use a micro level account data of roughly 100,000 JP Morgan Chase clients. And this is where they can actually directly observe changes in the incomes from one month to the next. And what they found was that vast majority, so 84%, had at least 1 month or more of volatility. But there, I think it's important to remember they're using a very low threshold for defining what we mean by an important swing. They just used a 5% swing above or below the previous month. And then when they use a higher threshold of 30%, it's still a very important share. At 55% of the accounts they looked at had 1 month or more volatility in their study period. Interestingly, they don't find that the swings in earnings are due to employment changes. In other words, they didn't see signs that people were changing jobs or losing jobs so much as uncertainty or instability in the earnings within the same employment from one period to the next. And they also were able, because of course they're looking directly at account data, they're also able to look at whether or not households had other resources, so savings that they could draw on to smooth their consumption. And in fact, they find that the vast majority of these households experiencing volatility did not have sufficient savings to be able to make up differences when their incomes changed from one period to the next. MAG and colleagues were able to use a survey of income and program participation in the US that again did allow them to look directly at monthly changes in income. They use that 25% benchmark, and they find that 50% of working age adults had at least 1 month of volatility. So very similar findings to the results from Farrell and Grieg. And that in the vast majority of those cases, so 39 out of the 50%, the change was a downward swing. More frequently, again, we're seeing that the volatility is affecting low income earners, who in the US in that particular study had a 40% had at least 6 months of the year or more of volatility, which means they're effectively living with chronic volatility. Let's talk very briefly about whether or not this incidence of volatility matters. Is it connected to worse outcomes? Well, I think that there is compelling reason to believe that it may actually be helping to condition shorter time preferences. So, authors that I'm sure most people will be familiar with, Barr, Mulanathan, and Shafir, have talked about this idea of people with low incomes who deal with chronic scarcity, facing essentially a kind of a cognitive tax where they become much more present rather than future oriented. Other studies, for example, the Financial Diaries project in the United States by Murdoch and Schneider, have also been able to document in a more sort of ethnographic way the dynamics of income volatility. And they find that the households they tracked who had more income volatility were much more likely to have to use high cost fringe lending services to be able to make ends meet from 1 month to the next. Other research that has looked at various forms of income volatility, again, generally annual swings, not necessarily month to month swings, although some of the studies do look at within year volatility, have reported lower savings affected by volatility, risks a higher risk of mortgage delinquency and missed bill payments, greater use, obviously, of those residual social programs and some food insecurity as well, lower educational engagement and poorer school performance for children in households affected by income volatility. And the studies also find that households are not necessarily able to adjust their overall monthly consumption in response to changes in their income. In other words, there are sort of periods of feast and famine, but nevertheless, there are some ongoing monthly expenses that households have to find ways of coping with, even if that means doing with less food, coping by resorting to higher cost fringe lending, and so forth. So, that research is not necessarily showing causal relationships between volatility and these more negative outcomes, but nevertheless, I think it's painting a fairly compelling case that income volatility can have a serious and detrimental effect on people's financial health and well-being. So now I'd like to talk very briefly about the study that was published earlier this year with Johanna Pietz, and it's one of a few studies that we published under contract with CPA Canada, who were kind enough to make available to us a unique survey data set. The data was actually collected online in 2015 for CPA. You can see there some basic information about the sample. So not the largest sample size, but certainly reasonable at 3,500. Covered adults ranging from 18 to 90 years of age, the respondents, and reasonable gender balance. So actually, not a bad sample in terms of comparability to the general Canadian population overall. And because of the various types of variables that were included, we were on our research on income volatility able to consider the effects of age and gender, education, kind of the usual demographic characteristics, as well as a measure of financial literacy, financial capability, and economic locus of control. And here I thought it might make sense just to explain how we measured each of those. So our measure of financial literacy is one that matches Statistics Canada, and I think is fairly well accepted as a method in the research on financial literacy, which is essentially to count the number of correct answers to factual questions. In this case, it was a short quiz of 14 factual questions on personal finance topics like who protects your bank deposits, who needs what kinds of insurance in the following scenarios, as well as questions about things like credit scores. Our measure of financial capability is a standardized score on 5 separate scales that measure self-reported behavior as well as self-confidence. And we include those measures of confidence because there is good reason to expect that attitude will reinforce behavior, and that those two are very much linked. The scales evaluate individual capability in making ends meet, which is really related to the ability of staying on top of ongoing expenses. Keeping track of money, which is very much about budgeting, but also about tracking money coming in and out. Planning ahead, which includes but is not limited to savings, both for medium and longer term needs. Choosing financial products and staying informed on financial matters. Our measure of economic locus of control is Farnham's scales of economic locus of control that measures both internal and external locus of control. So these are two separate scales. People who have an internal economic locus of control will tend to believe that economic outcomes are usually the result of personal responsibility. So, for example, it's associated with beliefs that people get rich by effort and people get poor out of bad choices, and that these are people who feel that they have some mastery over their own financial destinies. Likewise, those with a more externalized locus of control, feel instead that outcomes, financial outcomes, and their own financial prospects are really questions of luck or chance. This is a measure of income volatility on the CPA Canada data set. And as you'll see, it doesn't let us replicate the work in the US of quantifying month-over-month swings in income. But it does give us some insight into how people perceive their income as either volatile or stable, while also allowing us to separate the effects of changes in the amount from changes in the source. So we were able to use these questions also to construct an ordinal measure where we treat people who have stable amounts and stable sources of income as low in volatility, while those who report uncertainty in both as being high in volatility. Here are some initial results, and you'll see directionally they're quite similar to the TD Bank Ipsos findings for Canada, in that roughly a quarter of the respondents reported any form of volatility. A smaller share reported substantial volatility, at least in the amount, and just 6% reported high volatility of both source and amount. We did find that gender and income differences matter, but actually it was the modest income group that was most associated with having high volatility. Next, we find that mean financial literacy, so again, this is the mean number of correct responses on that test of objective knowledge, are lower among those with the most volatility, and that means scores on our measure of financial literacy rise as income becomes more stable. To our knowledge, this is the first time anyone has looked at the association between income volatility and financial literacy. And, it's kind of interesting to think about why these might be related. Well, on the one hand, if you believe in, rational, self-interested economic actors and the effects of human capital, then you might think that people who are just smarter about money find ways to stabilize their income and are better off for it. On the other hand, you might also imagine that there can be a relationship in the other direction, such that people who are coping with volatile incomes also just have fewer opportunities to learn the kinds of information that we measure on standard tests of financial literacy. Maybe they don't have time to read up on things like deposit insurance because they're just trying to be able to get through the month. Here we have our results for financial capability, and we find that in 4 out of 5 domains of financial capability, volatility is associated with significantly lower scores, particularly in making ends meet, which is again about meeting those ongoing expenses. Not surprisingly, this makes perfect sense. But also with regards to lower scores on planning ahead, which again is consistent with that behavioral economics research suggesting that scarcity or maybe chronic uncertainty imposes that kind of cognitive tax and makes it harder to think long term in favor instead of focusing on immediate needs. But we do have a bit of a puzzle here because here volatility is not related to behaviors and attitudes that would support ongoing financial learning. So that's the staying informed dimension. You remember in the last slide, I posited that maybe lower financial literacy scores could be a result of or a precursor to income instability, but more likely, I think there's something else going on. I'll say more about that in a moment. We also do find that greater volatility is associated with a more external locus of control and with a somewhat weaker locus of internal control. And again, this makes some sense if you think back to behavioral models of learning. Systems of random reward or random punishment schedules can actually be extremely effective in either promoting or deterring particular behaviors. But in either case, the locus of control is somewhat externalized. So I will not show you the table of our multivariate analysis. It just makes for terrible slides, but I'm happy to share those. The graphs displaying the result of our multivariate analysis are included in the larger report, but just for the sake of brevity, I thought I would just summarize them here for you. So when we can control for gender, age, education, and income, kind of the usual demographics, we find that our ordinal measure of volatility is significant and a negative predictor for making ends meet, for keeping track, for planning ahead, for choosing products, and that externalized locus of control again. But we don't find that it is significant, that income volatility is significant as a predictor of staying informed or of the financial literacy scores. So again, I think this confirms the hypothesis that we had looking at that bivariate relationship earlier, that it's actually the relationship between income volatility and financial literacy or staying informed is actually about something else. It's actually about other covariates instead. This comes back to the same data set, but it is a slightly different way of slicing the data. Here instead, I'm looking only at working age adults, so those 25 to 64. And rather than looking at those standardized scores of financial literacy and capability, I was interested in knowing whether or not I could find any association, so just a simple correlation between the income volatility measure and specific indicators that others have used for identifying financial difficulties. So things like making emergency withdrawals from long-term retirement savings, not having emergency savings in the house, using payday loans and carrying payday loan debt, specifically falling behind by 2 months or more on a bill. And I think what you see here is that the effects of income volatility are pretty small and actually end up not being significant. So this is a bit of a puzzle to try and figure out if income volatility seems to be associated with those lower scores on those composite measures, what's going on. So to sum up, we do find that within year volatility in Canada is reported by a small but noteworthy share of adult respondents. Um, we do find that there is a negative relationship with some financial outcomes, but it's not necessarily clear that specific outcomes. So we can find that poor scores on financial literacy and capability, but specific types of financial outcomes, it's not clear whether or not it's being driven by volatility or whether other factors matter. And in that research, looking only at the working age population, we were also able to look at for those households who also use those residual social programs like employment insurance and social assistance, did the volatility effect on negative outcomes, was it decreased or increased when they also used these other social programs? And what we found was actually that these programs that are meant to adjust to income from one month to the next actually increased the risk of lower financial well-being in our model. Now I'm going to talk very briefly about some work in progress. Again, this is work ongoing that Johanna Pietz and I are still doing. So this is the part I would particularly welcome comments and questions on. And we are interested in better understanding the relationship between income volatility, that measure of locus of control, and then savings behavior, because we believe that actually locus of control might be an important mediator. So our current work has essentially three components. We've got a pilot survey that we've done through Mechanical Turk. We wanted to see whether or not we could replicate the same association between income volatility and economic locus of control that we saw in the CPA data. We're also going to be doing analysis of longitudinal linked administrative and survey data so that we can quantify changes in income from one period to the next and see whether or not we can identify patterns that are related to savings behavior, but also some measures of attitudes as well. And we are right now in the process of completing a lab in the field experiment where we are working with a protocol that actually tries to replicate three different scenarios. One that is a gig work like scenario where participants complete tasks, but there's uncertainty both about the number of tasks available to them, the compensation, and so forth. One where it's more of the sort of salaried condition where participants know how much they're going to be compensated. The work level is predictable. So, amount and source of income are both relatively stable. And then a third that is more of a self-employment design where participants have uncertainty, but they also have greater choice or that sense of control over whether or not the income for a work period goes up or down. Why do we think that income volatility might have an effect on willingness to save? Well, if the future is uncertain, one response is to say, I should just focus on today, right? Which is consistent with a lot of behavioral economics research, finding that people who live with that uncertainty or chronic scarcity may become more present focused and less future oriented. On the other hand, sort of the rational economic model is that the future is uncertain. I should really save a little today in order to smooth out my ability to consume tomorrow. And here's, I think, a very simplified way of displaying our working assumptions or our working model about the relationship between volatility, locus of control, and then the observed behavior of willingness to save. So people arrive with certain endowments in terms of the demographic characteristics, but also, the pre-existing level of financial literacy, some financial attitudes and behaviors as well, which we are measuring as financial capability. And we realized that these endowments may themselves predispose them to greater or lesser degrees of volatility in their income, and may also predispose them to a greater or lesser sense of an internal economic locus of control. But that the effect of volatility or the relationship of volatility in terms of the observed behavior. And in our study, it's the willingness to save, so foregoing compensation in a period one for a slightly larger compensation in period two. We believe that that might be mediated by the economic locus of control. So in our lab in the field experiment, we would expect that the participants with the sense of control, in other words, the self-employed participants, might actually be more willing to save than those who are in the gig work condition. Here are some brief highlights from that MTurk study survey online. And again, it's a small sample, but nevertheless, I think it's another data point worth highlighting. We do find that 16% report that they feel that the volatility they're experiencing is outside of their control, while 37% report that they feel it's in their own control. Volatility overall, we do find is associated with things like missed bills and loan payments, and this is after controlling for household size, income amount, so on and so forth. But volatility that does not feel like it is in a person's control was associated with much lower scores on making ends meet, more self-reported financial stress, and lower life satisfaction as well. Let me talk very briefly about policy implications, and then I believe we still have time for questions. This kind of brings me back to the point that I made at the beginning about the existence of those residual social programs in Canada, the ones that are set up to adjust from one month to the other. I started this talk by pointing out something in the market conduct of financial institutions around trying to get people to automate their savings. We know it's a good strategy. And there's probably a role for public policy in thinking about the market conduct of financial institutions, but it's really more the social programs that I think I'd like to talk about very briefly here. And one thing I'm struggling with is whether we should be thinking about social programs that adjust on a month-to-month basis and seem to be associated with worse outcomes. Is the volatility in those incomes, in those benefits that we give to people who are in low income, is that a bug or a feature of the current design of programs? The graph that I'm showing you here comes from administrative data from the BC government, showing the share of households on provincial social assistance who had at least 1 month or more of income volatility in their benefits within a 12-month period. And what you can see is that it's a sizable portion. It has come down somewhat, but it is a sizable portion of households who are on social assistance who are living with income volatility. Remember, the US results suggested that social programs like food stamps can help families reduce the negative effects of income volatility. But our data in Canada, at least the CPA Canada data, was suggesting that when programs like employment insurance and provincial welfare are used, they actually increase the odds of bad financial events like missing a bill payment or using fringe financial services. So I guess I'll end by asking whether it makes sense, given labor market trends, to have the very programs that we count on to act as kind of automatic household stabilizers, in fact, acting as drivers of volatility. Are we encouraging people to exit programs and return to the labor market and be more self-sufficient by making the benefits more volatile and changeable? Or are we actually maybe discouraging forward planning and reducing the financial capability of families to make ends meet and maybe in fact actually prolonging benefit dependence? How do we equip our official statisticians in national and provincial agencies? I think this is another important question, to be able to track within year volatility in addition to year-over-year changes in income. So I've thrown out a few questions there for discussion and debate, and so I'll end now and then eagerly wait your own questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was very interesting, obviously. And I've created a lot of notes here because whenever we're doing multivariate analyses, I feel like it taxes my working memory significantly. So I actually really appreciated the sketch of your simplified model because that allowed me to see things a little bit more clearly. Our chat room is pretty quiet at the moment, so maybe you and I could just chat a little bit.
Sure thing.
So let me bring up my notes here, because I'm going to get to simplified model that you had.
Let me see if I can actually maybe go back to that. That might be useful. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, just one sec. Sorry, I have too much paperwork here.
Okay.
There it is. Okay. Thank you for that. So as I understand this working model, it's the demographic variables that you think are predicting volatility in the income swings on a monthly basis, which is then changing the locus of control, which is then essentially leading to perhaps problematic behaviors in the long term. Do I understand this model correctly?
So I think so. Nobody is ever going to hire me for my graphic design. So partly. So if we think about the endowments, right, those are going to be the demographic characteristics, which we know, right, will have an impact in terms of people's labor market attachment, their earnings, the stability of those earnings. But we're also thinking about endowments, at least in the ongoing work right now, Johanna and I. We're also thinking about endowments as being the financial knowledge that people come to financial decisions with, so their prior financial literacy, as well as the habits and the confidence that they feel, so those measures of financial capability as well. And we realize that those that knowledge, that those financial habits may also shape whether or not they experience volatility, as well as their sense of economic locus of control. So we realized that the endowments could have an effect on both of those variables from the outset, right? So before they, at least in our lab scenario, before they enter the lab, right, and conduct the experiment, receive the intervention, they're coming to the table with certain characteristics already. But when we expose them to the volatility condition, yes, we do expect that for those participants who are exposed to the gig employment condition, that they will actually experience a reduced sense of internal locus of control, that they will have a more external locus of control, and that compared to the self-employment condition where we expect that they'll have volatility, but that the effect of the volatility might be mediated in some way by perhaps still feeling a sense of control over the volatility they're experiencing. So we expect to find that people who are exposed to the self-employment condition will actually be more willing to save because they feel that some of the volatility is actually still within their control.
Understood. I think that's a very interesting hypothesis.
Great.
So yeah, I mean, obviously the direction of these relationships in many ways determines the approach that one would take to addressing various things. And so I don't think that I should share my own opinions here. And I think that what you're saying is completely reasonable. So we do have some questions now, and rather than just listening to me yammering on, I'll try to pass those along. One question is, do you think that there are differences in locus of control between people who engage in traditional versus gig employment that are unrelated to income? And I'll leave it at that, but there's a reason for this question, and it's because the reader thinks that to him or her, choosing to engage in gig economy work seems like it's being proactive and that you're taking charge of your own financial situation, which to this viewer would be more closely related to internal loci of control.
Right. I think it depends on what we're assuming about the type of gig employment. So remember earlier in the presentation, I showed that an important share of workers are engaged in gig employment, and for some of them, it's a side hustle, right? It's something that they do in addition to some other, perhaps maybe more traditional form of employment, and maybe for those people people, the experience of the gig employment does feel like something that they are in charge of, and that might be associated with the more internalized locus of control. But think instead about, for example, somebody who is a freelancer and who relies on essentially, gig platforms, right, for short tasks to be able to that's how they earn their entire living, right, is hoping that there will be enough jobs that they can bid on online platforms to be able to make ends meet from 1 month to the next. Or the Uber driver who doesn't necessarily know how many hours or how much income will be available to them. um, I think one thing that's interesting, right, about gig employment is that it can be pitched as providing a sense of control, but when you actually look at how much choice or how much control people who rely on these more informal forms of employment or informal forms of work, how much control they actually have over working hours, around levels of compensation, around working conditions, we would expect that they would actually experience a lower sense of economic locus of control. That they would experience a more externalized sense of locus of control.
Okay, that's a very interesting idea. We have another question here. Do you find any sort of locus of control to have a higher aversion to ambiguity? In other words, uncertain incomes. There's a
Right.
follow-up there. Yeah, go ahead.
I sus I suspect an aversion to volatility might actually be more associated with some personality traits. So if you think about sort of big five personality traits, that people who are perhaps scored lower on the dimension of openness. So those are the people who they'll try anything once, they'll eat any food once. Maybe people who are high in openness would have a greater tolerance for volatility. Ideally, we'll be able to do some research down the road, maybe to look at that dimension of personality. The economic locus of control variable is very much about whether or not you uh, have beliefs and a perception that your economic outcomes are either within your control or you're at the mercy of luck and forces outside your control.
Okay, there's a follow-up to that question, but I don't think that it actually depends on your answer to the first one. So I'm just going to say it. This is more kind of a behavioral economist question. Have there been any initiatives to encourage savings and framing it as a certainty in the long run? So basically reframing these things, reframing savings.
Right. Well, I
Or,
would say, isn't that, I mean, if anybody has spent any time in a bank branch lately, or looked at looked at a sales product for or sales information for investment products, the traditional pitch for saving is very much around future financial security and stability. What I'm thinking of in terms of those more automated, pay yourself first, save more tomorrow, direct deposit, I wonder though whether or not the design of those programs or products really are well suited for people who are in high volatility situations with regards to their income, where they can't necessarily count on having the same income from 1 month to the next, and where pre-committing to particular dollar amounts into a savings instrument might not be the right framing for them. I wish I could say that I had the right answer already set, but I do wonder whether or not the framing of automation and pre-commitment may in fact be inadvertently discouraging savings for some consumers.
could you elaborate on that just a little bit more? Not to, I think that's an interesting point, that you think that it might be discouraging people from saving more. Could you just unpack that a bit more?
Sure. So some of this comes from my work looking at participation in the Canada Learning Bond. So this is um, a, a program to help low-income families build financial assets for their children's future post-secondary education. And the Canada Learning Bond itself doesn't actually require any personal savings contribution on the part of the family, but it does have to be deposited into a particular kind of financial product called a registered education savings plan. And most promoters, most banks and other promoters of those products very much emphasize automated savings, right? They emphasize this is an investment in your child's future. You need to put aside, or you should be putting aside, a particular amount per month. Um, and then, they like to see automatic contributions. Um, and some of the work that I've been doing, looking at the take up of the learning bond, suggests that parents are actually willing to forego the so-called free money of the learning bond because the emphasis on saving in the RESP is so so anxiety provoking for them, right? They're very reticent to sign up for a savings product that is going to require them to make monthly contributions on an ongoing basis because they're not certain that they're going to be able to afford that.
Understood. So they don't want to lock into it because
Exactly.
of the, yeah. Okay. Thanks for clarifying. That makes a lot more sense to me. I wasn't completely clear where you were coming from, so I appreciate that. We do another question here from the chat. That question is, are there sector differences in time preferences that are unrelated to incomes? In other words, might gig economy workers have different time preferences than someone with the same income that is earned consistently?
That's a great question. We don't know. We don't know. This is that is a terrific research question. That should be the focus for future study. Absolutely.
Fair enough. That was a good question. Definitely an empirically testable one
Yeah.
as well. Very good.
Absolutely.
All right, Jennifer, I think we're winding down here. I just want to thank you again for joining us today in this webinar. Really appreciate it. Let the audience know that a full recording of this webinar will be available at our website. And you can get to that just by clicking on the side tab labeled Events, and then clicking the sub tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. Our next webinar is going to be held on January 15th in the new year. We're going to hear from Eric Singler, who's the Managing Director of BVA and PRS in Vivo, as well as the founder and president of the BVA Nudge Unit. And at this point, I'll just thank you all for attending, and you can exit this webinar by closing your WebEx screen. Thanks so much.